when you felt you put your own stamp on who you were, your identity?
27.
Wow.
27. I just, not that I did not divorce him because I didn't love him. He was the love of my life, truly. If anything, I left because, and I still loved him, I needed to find out what the world was like, really. It was one world.
You were 14 years old. Elvis was 24, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did your parents allow a 14-year-old teenager baby to be with this then superstar of...
It was not easy on my parents. You know, first of all, it was just an innocent meeting. And of course, you know, I was excited and I was reluctant because I didn't think they'd ever let me go.
In 1959, the world was still adjusting to the phenomenon that was Elvis Presley. With just a few years in the spotlight, he had already set the stage on fire with a sound that defied conventions and a presence that stirred both frenzy and fear. Parents scorned him. Teenagers adored him. The church condemned him. But Elvis, young, wild, magnetic, was unstoppable. Then suddenly it all paused. Duty called. The boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, traded rhinestones for fatigues and shipped off to West Germany with the U.S. Army. To some, it was a distraction. To Elvis, it was a ticking clock. 2 years away from the stage meant 2 years of potential irrelevance. But fate had a different plan. At a modest party near his base in Bad Nauheim, something happened that no PR team or record label could have ever scripted. A girl walked in. Not a groupie, not a Hollywood hopeful. Just a quiet 14-year-old named Priscilla Beaulieu, dressed modestly, her eyes lowered, her voice soft. She didn't scream. She didn't even flirt. She just existed. And Elvis noticed. "What grade are you in?" he asked her, already half smiling. "Ninth," she said nervously. He laughed. "You're just a baby." But he didn't walk away. In fact, the moment she didn't chase him, when she didn't treat him like the god everyone else saw, Elvis became intrigued. He sat at the piano, started to play, and sang directly to her. She would later remember how every note seemed aimed straight at her, like a secret being whispered beneath the music. That night planted a seed, a quiet, slow-growing fascination between two people from utterly different worlds. She was a military kid, raised on discipline and tradition. He was a global icon, rich, broken, adored, and deeply haunted. And yet, in her innocence, Elvis saw something he could no longer find in his world: peace. Over the coming weeks, she was invited back, not for parties, not for publicity, but for late-night talks, long silences, and slow emotional unravelings. She never expected to fall for him. He never expected to need her. But something irreversible had begun. This wasn't a teenage fling. This was the beginning of something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Priscilla was just 14, but the world she was stepping into aged her quickly. By the time her parents realized what was happening, it was already too late. Their daughter wasn't just meeting Elvis. She was part of his inner circle now. Her stepfather, a strict U.S. Air Force officer, demanded answers. He sat Elvis down, expecting celebrity charm. Instead, he got raw honesty. "I know she's young, sir," Elvis admitted, "but she's mature. She listens. I feel safe around her." It was enough. Permission was granted, grudgingly. And with that, the dynamic between them shifted. Elvis didn't just like Priscilla. He wanted to mold her, shape her, design her. The hair? Dark, styled like a movie starlet from the 50s. The makeup? Subtle, then gradually more glamorous, at his request. The clothes? Chosen to please him. Priscilla, barely out childhood, was being sculpted into the image of Elvis's ideal woman. And she complied, not because she was weak, but because she was in love. But there was always a catch. Their relationship remained, in Elvis's words, pure. Physical intimacy was off the table. Not because he didn't desire her, but because of his Southern values. The right girl, he often said, is worth waiting for. In his mind, Priscilla was that girl. So they kissed. They talked. They shared more than most married couples, but they didn't cross that final line. Not yet. When Elvis was deployed back to the U.S. in 1960, Priscilla was devastated. For months, she heard nothing. And then came the headlines, tabloid shots of Elvis with Nancy Sinatra, Anita Wood, and other glamorous women who had his attention while she waited quietly in Germany. She felt discarded, forgotten, until suddenly he called. He wanted her in Los Angeles. Just for 2 weeks, he said, just to see each other again. He'd pay. He'd arrange everything. Her parents resisted, but he'd already earned their trust. So she went. naively believing she was returning to the same boy she'd left behind. What she didn't know was that Elvis had just sent another girlfriend packing the day before she landed. He was living two lives, one in the spotlight, full of actresses and parties, and another in private, where Priscilla remained his untouched, perfect image of future devotion. He took her to Vegas, showered her in gifts, told her he was the only one who mattered. And she believed it, because how could she not? The glitz was blinding. The charm was overwhelming. But behind every loving gesture, there was control. He told her not to look at other men, not to speak to them, not to step out of line. She was his, and his alone. It wasn't a relationship. It was possession. Still, she stayed. Because when Elvis loved you, it felt like the sun was shining only on you. And when he looked away, it was like stepping into shadow. By 1962, the 2-week visit had turned into something far more serious. After spending Christmas in Graceland, Priscilla returned to Germany with a secret. Elvis had asked her to move to Memphis, to finish high school in the U.S., closer to him. At just 17, she was being asked to leave her home, her family, and everything familiar for a life with a man who, despite all his promises, still kept much of his world hidden behind velvet curtains. Her parents were hesitant, and rightly so. But Elvis wasn't a man who took no easily. He promised them she'd stay with his father, Vernon, and his stepmother, Dee, that she'd be cared for, that she'd remain a student, untouched, pure, that one day, eventually, he'd marry her. He swore on his mother's grave. And so, against their instincts, they said yes. Officially, Priscilla lived with Vernon and Dee. In reality, she lived in Elvis's room. The world still didn't know. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, made sure of that. There were no photos, no public outings, no declarations. Elvis had to remain available in the public's eyes. A single heartthrob meant higher sales, bigger crowds, and more revenue. A taken man, especially one with a teenage girlfriend, that was a liability. But behind the locked gates of Graceland, their world was something else entirely. Elvis controlled every aspect of her life. He chose her clothes, her hairstyle, her curfews. She was allowed to attend the Immaculate Conception High School, but outside of that, her existence revolved around his schedule. If he filmed in Hollywood, she waited. If he was on tour, she stayed home, wondering if he'd call. If he was in a good mood, the house came alive with laughter, music, and lavish gifts. If he was withdrawn, silence felt like a curtain. He was charming, generous, unpredictable, and slowly, she began to vanish inside his shadow. By late 1966, Priscilla had given him nearly 7 years of her life. She had grown from a teenager into a woman under the most surreal circumstances imaginable, living among gold records and pink Cadillacs, waiting in the wings while her boyfriend seduced the cameras on Hollywood sets. Through it all, she remained loyal. She kept his secrets. She endured the loneliness. And then, one quiet night in Graceland, it happened. Elvis got down on one knee. The ring sparkled with a 3.5-carat diamond, surrounded by 20 smaller stones. It was designed by a Memphis jeweler, but the true designer of the moment was Elvis himself, because he knew exactly when and how to ask. It wasn't over dinner. It wasn't during grand show. It was in the sanctuary of their bedroom, just the two of them, where he whispered the words she'd waited nearly a decade to hear. She said yes. Of course, she said yes. But even then, it wasn't simple. Colonel Parker wanted the wedding to be controlled. Quiet, exclusive, a scandal-free affair with no room for surprises. On May 1st, 1967, they left Palm Springs in secret and boarded Frank Sinatra's private jet bound for Las Vegas. At 3 a.m., they picked up their marriage license. By 11 a.m., they were husband and wife, married in a private room at the Aladdin Hotel by a Nevada Supreme Court judge, with just 14 guests in attendance. It was fast, clean, photogenic. The press conference afterward was brief. The champagne breakfast that followed, grand but hollow. And for a couple whose romance had always existed in extremes, either behind closed doors or under a microscope, it was a fitting compromise between spectacle and secrecy. Priscilla later called it unusual but perfect, a moment for them, not for the fans, not for the cameras, but as they posed with champagne glasses and tight smiles, few could have guessed what would come next. Because for all the glitter of their wedding day, the cracks were already forming. And the honeymoon, in more ways than one, wouldn't last long. Marriage changed little, at least not for Elvis. He was still Elvis Presley, the most desired man on the planet, idolized by millions, surrounded by sycophants, and caught in a Hollywood machine that didn't sleep. For Priscilla, However, everything changed. Now officially Mrs. Presley, she found herself balancing two identities: public wife to a global icon and private prisoner in Graceland. In February 1968, she gave birth to their daughter, Lisa Marie. The press adored the image, Elvis, the doting father. But behind the scenes, things were far less tender. Elvis didn't change diapers. He couldn't stomach watching his daughter eat, disturbed by the sight of baby food or the mess it made. That wasn't a man's job, he'd say. His love for Lisa was real, but filtered through the lens of spectacle. He gave her lavish gifts: a fur coat at age 3, a $5 bill for every baby tooth, and later, even named his private jet after her. But he wasn't present in the everyday way, and he never wanted to be. Meanwhile, Priscilla was vanishing again, this time not as a girlfriend, but as a wife. She was no longer the girl he tried to impress with piano serenades and sweet talk. Now, she was a mother, a fixture, and for a man obsessed with fantasy, that was a problem. The rumors came quickly. Elvis, it was said, was bored, and worse, he was unfaithful. Whether he was filming with co-stars like Anne Margaret or seen leaving parties in the middle of the night, whispers followed him. Priscilla began to lose sleep. She followed him to the dentist. She monitored his every move, but paranoia wasn't enough to hold him. The man who had once promised to love and protect her had built a life that made her feel utterly alone. And she wasn't wrong. In an attempt to connect, to recapture some piece of their shared world, Priscilla took up one of Elvis's obsessions: karate. At first, it was just a way to spend time together, but it soon became her own passion. She began training with Mike Stone, a charismatic martial arts instructor who had previously caught Elvis's attention during a tournament. Over time, their lessons turned into long conversations, and those conversations turned into something deeper. By 1972, the emotional cracks in her marriage had turned into canyons. Elvis was distant, erratic, and increasingly dependent on prescription drugs. Their connection, once so charged and unshakable, had dulled into routine, paranoia, and unspoken resentments. Priscilla found in Mike what she had once seen in Elvis: warmth, attentiveness, excitement. And she knew, the moment she let herself feel it, that she was betraying the man she had once given her entire youth to. But she also knew something else. For the first time in her life, she was thinking about what she wanted, what she needed. It was terrifying. It was freeing. Eventually, she sat Elvis down and told him she was leaving. His reaction wasn't anger. It was devastation. The man who had always controlled everything couldn't stop this. "I'm finding myself for the first time," she told him. He didn't argue. Maybe deep down, he already knew he'd lost her years before. Maybe he understood that the woman he had crafted into his ideal had finally outgrown the mold. Either way, the fairy tale was over. By the early 70s, the magic that had once made Elvis and Priscilla the golden couple of America was starting to fade, and not with a crash, but a slow, aching unraveling. On the outside, everything still looked picture perfect. Fans saw the lavish lifestyle, the romantic snapshots, the carefully managed public image. But behind the gates of Graceland, something deeply human was falling apart. Elvis was drifting, pulled under by the weight of superstardom, crushed by the endless touring, the hunger to stay relevant, the pressure to be everything to everyone. And at home, Priscilla was becoming a ghost of herself. She was still there, physically, but emotionally, she was becoming lost. Her life revolved entirely around his schedule, his moods, his needs. Her own identity, it barely had room to breathe. As the drugs crept further into Elvis's routine, so did distance. They talked less, touched less, laughed less, and for all the glitz and glamour, she was alone more often than not. Alone in Graceland, raising their daughter, watching the man she loved become a version of himself she no longer recognized. And then came the betrayal. Not just the rumors, not just the whispers, but her own heart drifting elsewhere. She started finding herself in the quiet moments of martial arts classes. In the presence of Mike Stone, her instructor, her confidant, and eventually her lover. For Priscilla, it wasn't just an affair. It was her way out, a step back into her own identity. And when she finally told Elvis she was leaving, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with quiet finality. For the first time, she said, "I feel like I'm discovering who I am." Their divorce was finalized in 1973. There was no courtroom drama, no venom, just two people who had tried everything and still couldn't save what they had. They walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, a symbol of the complex, beautiful, and broken love they had shared. But what the world didn't see was what lingered afterward. The private moments, the mutual respect, and the enduring bond they shared because of their daughter and the life they built. The romance was over. The empire had collapsed. But the story? It was far from finished. The end came quickly. August 16th, 1977. Elvis Presley, icon, father, former husband, was found dead in his Graceland bathroom. He was only 42. The news spread like wildfire. But for Priscilla, the moment was surreal. She was out with her sister, running errands, when her father called and told her that Joe Esposito, Elvis's longtime road manager, had been trying to reach her. Her first thought wasn't about Elvis. It was about Lisa Marie, who had been visiting her father. Panic set in. She sped home, ignoring traffic lights, heart pounding. And then the phone rang. Joe's voice was shaky, and what he said would forever mark the day as the worst of her life. She boarded a private jet to Memphis, her mind blank. But it was the moment she stepped into Graceland that everything became real. Vernon, Elvis's father, was sobbing, wailing with the kind of heartbreak only a parent can feel. The house was filled with shock and sorrow, and Priscilla, standing in the place that once symbolized love and luxury, now stood in the middle of loss. Elvis had died not as the rock god the world remembered, but as a man worn down by fame, by medication, by his own myth. His body had failed, but it was his soul that had been battered long before. But for Priscilla, there was no time to collapse. Vernon died 2 years later, and suddenly, she was left with a daunting responsibility: Elvis's legacy. Graceland, once their sanctuary, was hemorrhaging money. Advisors told her to sell. Lawyers suggested cutting losses. But Priscilla couldn't do it. She wouldn't. Instead, she did something no one expected. She transformed pain into preservation. She opened Graceland to the public, not as a tourist trap, but as a living tribute. She oversaw every detail, ensuring it reflected the man she had loved. And in doing so, she turned a grieving shrine into a global pilgrimage site. Within weeks, it became profitable. Within years, it became untouchable. Elvis wasn't just remembered, he was immortalized, and that's largely because of her. And through it all, Priscilla never remarried. Yes, she loved again. Yes, she built a life. But no one, not one person, ever replaced Elvis in her heart. I live for him, she once wrote. I breathe for him. Their love didn't survive, but it never truly died either. Even in death, Elvis wasn't alone. His final encore wasn't a concert or a film. It was the echo of a woman's love, long after the curtain fell. When Elvis passed, the world mourned a legend. But for Priscilla, the loss was something far deeper, personal, raw, and lasting. Suddenly, she wasn't just the ex-wife of the king of rock and roll. She became the keeper of his memory, the protector of his legacy, and the emotional anchor for their daughter Lisa Marie. In the years that followed, Priscilla could have stepped back, allowed time to blur the edges of their story. Instead, she stepped forward. She made it her mission to preserve not just Elvis's music, but the truth of the man behind the myth. Through her leadership, Graceland became more than a tourist attraction. It became a sacred space, visited by millions who longed to connect with the soul behind the voice. But maintaining that legacy wasn't easy. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every appearance judged, and yet she carried it with quiet dignity. She didn't just survive in Elvis's shadow. She built her own spotlight, becoming a businesswoman, actress, and mother to 2 children who each bore their own version of the Presley name. Even as she moved on with her life, Priscilla never distanced herself from the truth of her past. She shared stories not to glorify, but to humanize. She told of the laughter, the chaos, the grief, and the guilt. She didn't rewrite the narrative, she expanded it. And with every year that passed, fans came to see her not just as someone who once loved Elvis, but as someone who still does. Not in a fairy tale kind of way, but in a way only those who've truly lived and lost can understand. Priscilla's legacy is now deeply entwined with his, not because she stayed in his world, but because she carried it forward. And through her, the story of Elvis Presley remains not just a tale of fame, but of family, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love. Decades later, Priscilla Presley still walks with Elvis, just no longer beside him. Though their marriage ended, the bond never broke. She never remarried, not out of grief, but because no one else compared. Elvis, for better or worse, was the love of her life. Even now, she doesn't just honor his legacy, she protects it. At premieres, in interviews, and through every quiet memory, she's ensured the man behind the myth is remembered with truth. Priscilla's story isn't just about who she loved. It's about the strength to carry that love forward, long after the lights went down. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Priscilla ever truly moved on from Elvis? Or was he the one love that shaped everything after? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story pulled you in, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold chapters of music legends, and turn on notifications so you never miss a beat. There's so much more ahead.